Amp Studio has a lot more than just loops inside of it. It's got a host of devices from effects to synthesizers, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Volt Mini and the Volt Premium. So if we open up a couple down here, you see at the bottom there's this thing called a device chain. And on the first track of every project, you will have a Volt Mini just start you right up. So if you click the edit, you can actually see the interface of these devices. And there's a whole bunch in here. We have instruments. These are things that generate sound and they will respond to MIDI. And then we have what are called effects. These are things that need a sound input in order for them to have an effect. For example, we have here a Volt Mini. It is an instrument. And if we add a device, say a delay, the delay must come after the Volt Mini in order for it to have an effect. And we will hear a delay on the Volt. So you can hear that delay there. So pretty cool what we can do with this. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing here on the Volt Mini and the Volt, the premium version. So the Volt Mini is what is called a subtractive synthesizer, meaning it gives you a waveform, it gives you a sound, and then you apply processes to it to remove parts of the sound. Kind of like how if you had if you were going to sculpt something, you would have a brick of marble, and then you would chip away at the marble to bring out the sculpture. And it's kind of like that with sound. And that's kind of the basis of what's called subtractive synthesis. So first up, I'm going to just cover some of the basics here. We've got a preset menu up here. If you click this, you can very quickly audition various sounds. Now, if you have a MIDI controller, it's going to be much easier to audition these sounds. But if you don't, you can actually come over to the library, and you may have noticed two types of files in here. They have these little note files. These are called MIDI files, and they're the files that send instructions on what to do. When I hit a key on the keyboard, it actually doesn't send a sound. It sends an instruction. It says he hit this note at this time with this much speed. We call that the velocity. That tells it how loud to play, when to play, and what note to play. And so these are MIDI files, and we can actually just drop these on and just load them up on our track here, the first track, which has the Volt Mini on it. And we can audition various presets while letting it play through this file. And I highly recommend perhaps setting a loop region. That way you could just keep looping and trying out different sounds. So we can try out blank. Go for keys. You gotta wait for it to hit a new note. And so that is another way to try out some different presets and peruse if you don't have a MIDI controller handy that you can just sort of fiddle with. Another advantage to using MIDI clips is you don't need the strongest background in music theory. You can just drag on a MIDI clip, let the synthesizer start to play it, and you can focus on the sound rather than the specific notes that are going on. And you can very easily come in and change the notes and alter them, perhaps just move one or two to your liking to customize it to whatever you're doing at the time. So let's jump into the Volt Mini synth and go over a couple basic things. So you have a oscillator here. So an oscillator is your fundamental sound generating unit. It generates sound, and if an oscillator was left on its own, it would just generate sound forever. Nothing would tell it when to turn on or when to turn off. It would just generate sound. And then we have what's called the amp. So the amp tells it when to turn on and when to turn off. So right now the amp is set so that this is the shape that gets applied. So when we press a note, the amplifier sends this picture essentially to the synth. Meaning when I press a note, it immediately turns on. And it continues and it stays on. This is called the sustain. And when I let go of the note, it exits the sustain and we get this very short release, 100 milliseconds. So that's actually what these stand for, is attack, decay, sustain, release. Sustain is when you hold the note, attack is when you just push the note, release is when you let go of the note. Decay is this middle ground between attack and sustain. and we're not going to really focus on it right now. So for example, I could drag this over. This increases the attack. It'll take longer for the sound to turn on. So that's the amp, and that controls the oscillator, so the oscillator just isn't constantly making noise. There's a couple other cool things we have in here. So you notice up here we've got these tabs. We've got the amp tab. We've also got the filter tab. There's all kinds of cool filters. Filters are kind of like when we're taking off pieces of the marble to make our sculpture. Filters are kind of like the different tools we use to get those pieces off of the piece of marble. So here we could shave off pieces of our sound, and for now, there's just a couple controls you should really be aware of. The first control you should be aware of is this menu up here. So there's 3 different kinds of filters in this in the Volt Mini: a low pass, a high pass, and a band pass. And I'm gonna sort of leave it up to you, and probably future videos, to dive into what each of these do and how they're useful in sound design. But once you select one, these 2 parameters are the big ones you're going to want to mess with. So FC stands for frequency cutoff. So I've selected a simpler preset to show this, but once we've selected a filter type, you can move the frequency cutoff in order to hear what the filter will do to it. So in this case, a low pass, that's low frequencies pass. So when it's up, it's not blocking any high frequencies. It's essentially a high cut. It takes away high frequencies from a sound. You'll hear it said both ways, a high cut or a low pass. It can be a little confusing. Q is a parameter that involves the resonance of the filter, and I think it's most easily just demonstrated. You'll recognize the effect. So I'm going to dial it up pretty high. So you get those kinds of effects. If we bring it down a bit, that nice filter, yeah. If we don't have any Q, it's a much more like a volume knob kind of, instead of that nice resonance moving up and down. So when you hear people talk about resonance, they're probably talking about Q. And when you're going to notice a lot of sounds that heavily rely on filters and what they can do. So our basic building blocks are an oscillator, then we have an amplifier that turns the oscillator on and off in a way that's useful, and then we have a filter to help sculpt our sound, and we actually can also control it in a similar way we can control the amplifier. In fact, when we control something in this way, we say that we are using an envelope. That's what these are called, and you're going to see them in most synthesizers. You might not always get a graphical representation. You might just have the ADSR, and there's other types of envelopes, but it's very, very common unit of synthesis. Now there is an advanced tab. I'm going to leave that for another time, but there is a whole lot more we could dive into with the various parts of synthesis. And in our oscillator, just a couple controls here that you may want to mess with. Unison adds voices. Basically, when you have a sound, an oscillator generates one waveform. Unison can generate more waveforms, and this can add a lushness to the sound. Versus just one. Let's turn it all the way up. Here's 7. So you hear things moving around, and that movement is controlled by detune. Each one of these oscillators has a slightly different tuning. And if we turn this up, we can get much more of a phasey sound, is what people call it. A detuned phasey sound. So you hear this on all sorts of dance leads. It's a very popular effect. You also have octave. This controls how high or low the sound you're playing is. So besides just, playing higher or lower notes. So that could be a really useful setting, especially if you have a small number of keys and you don't want to be shifting up and down the keyboard. And then finally, you can choose different waveforms here at the top. And I'll let you go ahead and mess with that stuff. So that is the Volt Mini. Now we can go ahead and open up the Volt, the premium version. And the premium version has quite a number of advantages when it comes to it. First, you get 2 sets of oscillators. You get an oscillator A and an oscillator B, and they mimic the Volt Mini. But on top of that, you can actually go to a part 2. So you get 4 oscillators, allowing for much more complex patches to be built and saved. You also have various synth modes, which can invite modulation. And I know you don't know what modulation is yet, but just trust me on this, it's dang cool. And after modulation, you also have quite a number of options in here in the advanced section, as well as some more filter types. So there's just a lot more options. And as you get into more advanced synthesis, you'll very quickly find yourself opening up the Volt synthesizer as opposed to the Volt Mini, just because it allows for much more complicated sounds, which often translates to much more musical and interesting sounds. Not to say you can't do that with the Volt Mini. You totally can. It's just a lot easier and there's more possibilities with the Volt Premium. So let's go ahead and get started and make a small track really quick. And I just sort of want to demonstrate, if you're brand spanking new and you don't know what all these things are, a couple key things you can try out and mess with to get yourself going. So first off, I would go ahead and load up whatever you have. I'm going to use the Volt, the Premium Volt, and I'm going to go and I'm going to look for a chord MIDI, because chord MIDIs are going to be a bit easier to work with, I think. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to go to construction kits, and what the heck, we'll go for kit 5 and we'll look and see. We've got some piano here. This should be good. So we'll go ahead, we'll drop this in. It's got some nice chords on it. I'm going to come into my presets and I'm going to look for a keys preset or a lead preset. What the heck, we'll try out 4. We'll audition this. Let's go for another preset here. So I quite like this bell kind of sound. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spice the bell sound up by coming into add devices. And I'd like there to be a little more space on it. And one way to do that is to add a reverb. So I'm going to come to effects and I'm going to choose reverb. And I like that. I like that where this is going. And you don't need to stick with this exact, MIDI layout. It may be of interest to you to come in here to chop up different sections in various ways and experiment with moving them around. So on and so forth. And what we could do now is we can look for some sick drums. Why not? All right, so we've got our sick drums. Our sick drums are pretty loud though, so I'm going to come down here and with the track selected, I'm going to turn down the volume on these a bit and dial it up to something I think would be more useful. I'm also going to hold Alt click drag. That's how I'm cloning things very quickly. Now I can push it up to where I think is a bit more reasonable. Now what we can do is we say, hey, this is a pretty cool sound. Let's go ahead and come back to track 1, open up that Volt Mini, and try out some different things. For example, we could try a triangle wave for the oscillator A. We could try out another waveform, maybe a sawtooth. Let's try a different filter. Let's go for a low pass filter. And that sounds pretty nice. Now you might be thinking, hey, it'd be cool if these knobs could move on their own, right? Well, they can. That's called automation. So you can actually come in, choose this little automation icon. That's what this is. And you can go to add parameters. And every device you have is going to have parameters that can be moved because they have knobs and whatnot. We want to move the frequency cutoff. So I'm going to come on the Volt and I'm going to come down to part 1 filter frequency cutoff. I'm going to put a dot next to that and close it. I'm going to click on it, the automation icon again, and go to Volt part 1, the thing we just added, filter frequency cutoff. And above, I'm going to close this. Actually, I'm going to keep it open because I want you to see that this moves. So a line has been added that will control, as you can see down here, it's a little tough to see. But if I click and add a point, so this is the frequency cutoff will be at 0, and we can go ahead and bring it up over time. And this will turn the frequency, it'll open up the filter over time. You will see the knob move. could have it come up very quickly, maybe at the middle, and then come back down. That could be kind of cool. And you can do this with all the knobs and things in here. If it's in that list, you can automate it, and that can add so much life to your track and really give it a unique sound and space. And that is automation, and that can really take your track to another level. I highly recommend being experimental with trying out different patches and trying out some automation. Try changing a few things. Just get a mastery of a couple of things at a time. I know it can be overwhelming, but this is going to get you going. You know, you can make a track with some MIDI clips, with some drum loops, get a vibe for what some of the effects do, what some of the synth patches sound like, and really get rolling and have something that's pretty cool. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe and hit that bell icon for future videos. And have a blessed day.